Good seat. Hey everybody, we're back again. We went and drag raced the Volvo last weekend against Lucas in the CRX. You can see that in one of the last two vlog episodes. It was a lot of fun. It's awesome not having a slipping transmission, but with having the proper transmission in the car now and being able to put all the power to the ground, I have run into a few more issues. Today we're going to go a little more in depth in how turbos work, how boost is controlled, and different ways to fix a common issue that you'll see around the internet with a lot of different people's builds, and that's boost creep. So we'll dive into the different ways to tackle it, and I'm going to actually do one of them, what I consider to be kind of the first step to try on the Volvo, and see if that fixes our issue. So we're going to start off with kind of the basics of how a turbo works. If you don't know, if you do, feel free to skip ahead. So this is our engine. I have a 4-cylinder engine, so I drew a 4-cylinder and it's easy to draw. So what happens is you have air coming into the compressor side of the turbo right here that is being compressed and put into the engine, and then combustion happens and the car moves and things like that. And then you have all this hot exhaust gas expanding and trying to get out of the engine and out of the exhaust. But there's this turbo in the way. And what it does is as all of this expands and goes through the turbo, it spins the turbine wheel in the hot side of the turbo, which is linked directly to the compressor wheel in the cold side. And then after it goes through there, of course, it goes out the exhaust, but that is actually what compresses the air coming in on the cold side so that you then have above atmospheric pressure in your intake manifold and entering your cylinders. More air in the cylinder means you can put more fuel in the cylinder as well, which means you're making more power. So this is a very, very, very basic setup. This is how a lot of diesels and very inefficient older engines work, because they were essentially trying to make as much boost as possible all the time, because they were never nearing the limits of what the turbo could, well, they were at the limits of what the turbo could produce and not near the limits of what the engine could produce. So more boost was always better. Modern diesels, especially race diesels, they don't run any sort of wastegate or boost control setup. They run the engine as hard as they can. Absolutely every ounce of the turbo is producing as much power as it can to put as much air into the engine so they can keep making more power. The big issue with making as much boost as possible all the time is with more modern turbochargers and modern engines, you can make too much boost and in turn make too much power with the motor. You start breaking rods, pistons, cranks, cylinder walls, all that kind of thing. There's only so much heat and so much power the engine can handle. And the turbochargers are capable of pretty much producing as much boost as you want. I mean, that's, in my case, I can produce more boost than I will ever need to run through this engine. There are cases out there where no, a turbocharger will not do it. We'll get into all the turbo sizing stuff maybe in another vlog episode. So what we have to deal with is something called boost control. I'll write it over here just so we can all be on the same page. All right, so boost control is typically handled by something called a wastegate. There are two different ways that a wastegate can work. You hear a lot of people talk about internal and external wastegates. Well, the difference is to limit how much boost the turbo is producing, some of this air needs to bypass the turbine wheel right in here. So we'll start with an external wastegate setup because it's easier to draw and it'll probably make a little more sense. Imagine, if you will, there's another pipe, my marker will work, coming off of the exhaust manifold. And then you have this box right here, that is going to be your external wastegate, and then it goes straight back into the downpipe right there. So basically, as the boost increases, a valve in this starts to open, which allows exhaust gases to bypass the turbo straight into the exhaust system. If there's less exhaust gases coming through here, it doesn't build as much boost. So by doing that, you can limit how much boost you want, and there's different ways to do it: manual boost controllers, electronic boost controllers, all that kind of thing, but they essentially all work exactly the same in conjunction with a wastegate to allow the exhaust gases to bypass the turbo. So that is the very simple explanation. In my car, I'm running an internal wastegate setup, not an external, because it's a pain to make a manifold and downpipe that work with a external wastegate when you have the room to fit an internal wastegate. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at what the actual exhaust housing looks like and how an internal wastegate matches up with all of that. So an internal wastegate takes the exact same idea of bypassing the exhaust gases around the turbine wheel, but instead of having some sort of actual external wastegate that's hooked to both the manifold and the downpipe, this is looking at essentially the hot side of a turbo from the back. So this is the turbine wheel, that's the actual exhaust housing that's on the other side. This would be the flange that the downpipe mounts to. This right here is another hole that is next to the turbine wheel. You gotta think all the air is coming in from the side or wherever the actual flange is, and it's getting spun around this thing and then hits this wheel and exits out of the board towards you. And that's where all the exhaust gases would go if it wasn't for this little hole right here. So now there's a hole with a flapper valve on it, and there's some sort of wastegate actuator hooked up to an arm on that flapper valve. So this can open to allow exhaust gases to bypass the turbine wheel, basically come straight from in the housing, wherever it is, and out this way straight to the downpipe. This is how mine works. It is a good system. It's how most OEM turbos are controlled. The downside is I bought a really cheap eBay turbo. I think I paid $124 shipped for it. They expect you to use an external wastegate. The housing still has the hole, but this whole flapper arm assembly and all that does not come with the turbo. I bought another very cheap eBay part that allows you to convert it into an internally wastegated turbo. The problem is you have, let's say this is the hole that the flapper is supposed to go over. Well, the kit I bought, on an OEM turbo, it might be that size. Well, on mine, it's this little tiny hole that is way smaller than what it could be. And the flapper valve is still a flapper valve that is big enough to cover the big OEM hole. So basically, whenever this valve opens, I'm limited by just this little bit of area right here. That's all the area that the exhaust has to bypass the turbine wheel. So basically, the flapper valve can be all the way open, and I'm still not bypassing enough to not build too much boost. This is an issue now because with this transmission in the car, I can put more load on the engine, and more load means I can build boost faster and build more boost. And along with the recent weather and it being colder out, the air is more dense, which also makes everything more efficient. So now I can run absolutely zero duty cycle on my electronic boost controller, and I'm still making over 22 pounds of boost by the time I hit redline. And that's with an 11 pound, I think it's either a 9 or 11 pound spring in the wastegate. So obviously I'm having severe boost creep issues. So what we're gonna try to do is take the turbo out, take it apart, come in here and actually make that hole bigger so it matches that flapper valve better. And maybe we'll take a little bit of material off the backside of the wastegate actuator just to allow it to open a little bit further so yet again more gas can get by. Let's do it. So this will be the first time that this turbo is out of the car since I installed it. And since in the eBay ad, they said not to push it past 14 PSI. That was what I guess the turbo is technically rated for. And I've been running around 20 through it for about 2,000 miles now. I'm very curious to see how it has held up. I would not be surprised if we see a little bit of oil leakage and other issues on the seals, but there's only one way to find out, and we're doing it right now. All right, so there's these 4 studs that are holding everything on, and then the only thing that'll be left that I have to disconnect is the oil drain off the bottom of the turbo, if I can even figure out how to get to this last nut. There's a lot of things in the way. Alright, I'm gonna go ahead. Voila! Alright, so this is a turbocharger. Essentially, this is the cold side compressor housing I was talking about. This is the hot side turbine housing. A few other little points are up here at the top. This is the what's called the the center housing and rotating assembly. Basically, both wheels and everything are attached to each other through a rod that goes through this housing right here. Since everything's spinning, it needs lubrication. So this is where the oil feed goes into the turbo. And if you look down there, see that guy? That is the oil drain. Notice how it's a lot bigger on the drain side because you have pressurized oil coming in here, and then this is essentially just like dripping out of the turbo. So you need to have a lot of volume there. One of the big issues people run into is they run too small of an oil drain for the feed that they're running. And that causes the oil to back up, and if this starts to fill, you start blowing oil out the seals, and oil starts basically cooking inside the center housing, severely diminishes the life of the turbo. So especially if you're going to get a cheap eBay one, make sure you size things properly. A lot of them do not come with an internal restrictor for the pressure, so it's really easy to run too much oil to them as well. Look up whatever the rating is for the real version of whatever cheap turbo you're buying. Make sure you get a plate like this one that has a restrictor hole down in there where you have the oil feed to it. As you can see, this turbo still spins, does all those fun things. A little bit of radial play, cannot touch the housings though. That's to be expected because they're journal bearings. If you come in here and you try to push it in and out, there's absolutely no play. That is what you want. You do not want to feel the whole rotating assembly moving back and forth. I mean, it'll move just enough that you can feel it kind of like touch and then not touch, but it's not like it's like moving around in there. So what we're really interested in is all this. Don't worry about that. We are interested with this wastegate actuator housing and this hot side. So I'm going to go ahead and disassemble this turbo. The first thing that we're going to do to start taking the exhaust housing off of this turbo is we're going to remove, this is the wastegate actuator. This is that arm I was talking about, the flapper valve is in there. So basically this thing pushes and pulls, which I mean, there's more resistance on it than I can do. And that's what makes all this work together. There's this little, circlip right there. I'm gonna grab a screwdriver really quick. All right, we're gonna pop off this circlip and get the arm, the actuator arm off of the flapper valve arm. Make sure not to lose that guy, he's kind of important. Alrighty then, let's pop it off. So, now that that is separated, we can come back over here and start popping these guys off. This is when it's really nice to have a vise so you're not having to hug the thing. Maybe somebody will buy me one for Christmas. And this is what is commonly referred to as a 5-bolt exhaust housing. I think Ford was the first to start using this style. Just when you're talking different flanges, this is a V-band where the downpipe attaches to it, but this actual flange that the wastegate housing attaches to the exhaust housing is what is called a 5-bolt. There's lots of different ones out there. Different manufacturers use kind of like their own proprietary stuff, but it works. All right, so this comes off. Just like the picture earlier, you see turbine wheel, wastegate port. I don't know if you can see on the camera, but you can see the mark where the flapper valve is way larger than that hole. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna open that thing up, smooth stuff out, and hopefully improve the situation a bit. All right, I have everything loose. We're about ready to take the exhaust housing off, but one point I want to make really quick is if you're going to do this at home with any of your turbos or anything, make sure that you use a paint pen or something to mark the orientation of the housing with the center housing or the other, just something else on the turbo. So when you put it back together, you know if it's on straight or not. Because if it's off a little bit, it might make it getting it back in the car and get everything lined up again and hooked up really, really difficult. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna come in here and I'm gonna mark a line across right there, and I'm gonna flip it a little bit and mark one out there. So with 2 lines, I should be able to get this back together straight no matter what. All right, so now I can proceed to getting all of these little clamp bolts off. There we go. There we go. Now it rotates. So what we're looking at here is this is the exhaust housing. That's the hole we're looking at porting, which exhaust gases come in here off the manifold. This is where the wheel would be. Typically it would, go around and make that spin and all, but instead they get bypassed through that hole, and I don't know if you can see in the light, I'll try to get it where you can see it. You can kind of see where the flapper valve has been and how it's way, way larger, so we're just gonna make that bigger and make it work. All right, so to make sure that I don't port the wrong areas and cause issues, I've taken my trusty paint pen and painted the lip of the actual flapper. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna open and close it in there a few times, hopefully while the paint's still wet. I put 2 bolts back in just so that I know everything's lined up properly. And now that I've done that, we should be able to take these bolts back out, take that wastegate housing off, and take a look and see if we have managed to mark it correctly. That didn't really work. I probably needed to do it faster. It's hard when it's on video, but the marks that are there are all lining up with what I thought was the outline, so I'm just going to call that good enough. All right, as you can see, I took the paint pen again and kind of outlined where I want to go. So basically, I know that if I start touching the white, I'm getting too close to the edge. You want to leave a bit of a lip so the flapper can still seal properly and you actually have a closed wastegate when you want to have a closed wastegate. So I have a carbide burr in this Dremel. That's what I'm going to use. As always, put on some safety glasses. Here we go. Alright, I just got done hogging that hole out a bit. It's a decent bit bigger than what it was. I also tried to round off everything down in here so that when gases are coming into here, it's more of a smooth transition. Hopefully it'll promote a little more flow through the wastegate hole. Obviously it's not perfectly round. Using a little carbide small radius bit, you're going to end up with waviness. I'm going to come back with a not sure if a grinding stone or one of the sanding bits is going to work better, but one of the bigger round drums. Go in there and smooth things out and it should look pretty decent. Alright, got done with that sanding bit. As you can see, it's pretty smooth. There's still some nicks and stuff from when I was using the carbide bit. Not too worried about those. The big thing is, look at how much bigger that hole is. I can like fit my whole thumb in there now. Couldn't do that before. So, hopefully, I just don't want to get too close to the edges because I really don't want to run into any sealing issues that would make me spool later. It already spools at like 4,000 RPM. Don't want to hurt that any at all, just looking to be able to flow more. through this wastegate when I need to up top. So hopefully that'll do the trick. I think I'm done grinding, so I'm going to put this turbo back together. But first, clean this out really good, make sure there aren't any metal shavings still in there. Put it back together, put it back in the car, and then we'll see if it makes a difference. Alright, I just went out, drove with the Volvo, got everything back together. Don't seem to have any leaks or anything like that, which is good. The new ported wastegate hole does seem to be helping the situation. If you want to look right over here, I have a data log that I just pulled shortly ago. This is at 0% duty cycle on the boost controller, so this is using just the wastegate spring. And the white line here is RPM, the yellow line is the absolute manifold pressure, and the green is AFR. Ignore that little guy. I still need to do some more tuning now that I have a more consistent boost curve to deal with. So, as you can see over here, this is basically, when I nail it, is right in here. The torque converter slips, catches, and then the RPMs build linearly. So as that happens, this is where I'm building boost, and basically the wastegate is closed. The spring in it is causing it to open right here, which is at 170 kPa. So that's about 10 pounds of boost, which makes sense. And then here it is creeping on up to about 190 in first gear. Then it shifts and drops back down, and the highest I see is about 200 kPa, which is only about 14.5 pounds of boost. So I'm having about 4.5 psi of boost creep, which is manageable. If you were trying to run this eBay turbo with the cheap wastegate actuator and your car couldn't handle that much boost, then you'd have an issue. But since I'm planning on running 20 or more, 4 psi of creep with a 10-pound spring really isn't anything I can't overcome. So the next step is to get all the closed loop stuff trying to work, so instead of having these little ramp ups and dips and ramp ups, it'll just be a flat line the whole way across. But we'll get there. For now, I would say it's been a success. It's made it where I don't have to spend more money trying to buy nicer wastegate actuators and all that kind of stuff, so we'll leave it there.